Have you ever run into a null pointer exception error while coding in Java? It's really frustrating. But here's some good news. Java 8 has a tool to help avoid this problem. The optional class. In this video, we'll look at what optional is, why it's useful, and how it can make your code easier to read and safer to run. Ready to find out more about optional? Let's jump in. Let's start with the problem. Null pointer exceptions are errors that happen when you try to use something that hasn't been set up or initialized. Imagine trying to grab something that isn't actually there. Your code doesn't know how to handle that. These errors can cause your program to crash. To help avoid this, Java 8 introduced the optional class, a simple way to handle values that might be missing. The optional class was created to make it easier to deal with values that might be missing without breaking your code. Instead of setting something to null, you can use optional as a kind of box that may or may not have a value in it. This makes it easy to check if there's something inside before you try to use it, keeping your code safe and clear. Using optional is pretty simple. If you know a value is in null, you can use Optional.of method. For an empty box, use empty method. And if the value might be Null.ofNullable method works well. To check if something's inside, use isPresent method. And to do something only when there's a value, use ifPresent method. Here's an example. Let's play with the example. Quickly create class name optional example and main method to proceed. Alright, so first thing, we're working with an optional object which might or might not contain a value. I create one here using Optional.ofNullable. Around this getName method, just in case getName returns null. That way, we avoid a potential null pointer exception. Let's store that in optional name. I've got this mock method getName, which for now returns null. In a real-world scenario, this would be dynamically fetched from somewhere, like a database or an external service. In step 2. Now I want to check if the value is present, and if it is, I'm going to print a welcome message. For that, I'll use a present method, and in the lambda, I'll print the name with a greeting. In step 3, if the optional is empty, I don't want the program to fail. Instead, I'll provide a default value. So here I'll use or else method to return a default name guessed if the value is absent. Then I'll print it. Alright, for cases where the name is critical and cannot be absent, I'm going to use or else throw method. If it's empty, I'll throw an illegal state exception with a custom message name is required. If it isn't empty, I'll print the critical name. Let's summarize the code. The provided Java code demonstrates the use of the optional class, which is part of the Java 8 Stream API. The optional class is used to represent a value that may or may not be present. This is particularly useful to avoid null pointer exception and to handle cases where a value might not be available. Here's a breakdown of the code. This defines a public class named optional example. This is the entry point of the program. This creates an optional object that may contain a string returned by the getName method. If getName returns null, the optional will be empty. This method checks if the optional contains a value. If it does, it executes a provided lambda expression which prints a welcome message using the name. This method returns the value if present, otherwise it returns the default value guessed. The result is stored in the name variable and printed. This method throws an exception if the optional is empty. The exception message's name is required. The try-catch block catches the exception and prints the exception message. This is the mock method that returns null. In a real scenario, this method would fetch the name dynamically. If you have any queries, let us know by comment. To recap, the optional class in Java 8 is a powerful tool for managing null values safely. It helps prevent null pointer exceptions, makes your code cleaner, and makes your intent clearer for others reading your code. Just remember, use optional wisely to avoid performance impacts. If you found this video helpful, consider using optional in your next Java project. Subscribe and hit the bell for more tips on Java programming.